Thank you, KOTESOL, for getting me here. Thank you for making it to this last plenary of the conference, but still lots of interesting things to go, I'm sure. I was very pleased to have a chance to address this theme, from practice to theory. I'm going to stick pretty closely to it, I believe, and try to have it make sense in terms of two areas that I've been thinking about and working with in the last few years: philosophies of language teaching and critical language pedagogy. But as I first responded mentally, at least, to the invitation, I wondered if they'd got the wrong man, because when working in a sort of related line of thought some years ago, I was much more in the theory to practice line. And there's a couple of papers that I was asked to write back in the 90s that indeed defended that kind of theory to practice connection. And I'm grateful to Dusty Dustheimer, one of the KOTESOL officials, who, when introducing Dick Allwright's plenary, mentioned that KOTESOL had a plenary, had a conference on the theme of theory to practice almost 25 years ago, and that was very much the way things went, the way people thought at that time, and that's probably why I also was asked to write on that topic at that time. And indeed then I was more or less defending a theory to practice direction. It's interpreted more or less as a sort of researcher to teacher direction. But I was defending it with some difficulty, because there were considerable obstacles and limitations to that theory to practice position. And I dug up one of those old pieces recently and took a quick look at it, because I couldn't really trust my memory after all these times. Do I really know what I wrote in 1996? I don't think so. I see I concluded it with a fairly sort of trenchant, muscular statement that was sort of trying to put the wind up SLA researchers who were not doing a very good job in promoting the theory to practice line, I felt, at that time. I'll just read you a bit of it. If SLA researchers, so it's the research line first, it's the theory line first, are to take any responsibility for sustaining what was then seen as a theory to practice relationship, they must either incorporate socio-political considerations as they apply to teachers into their investigations, which would mean a redefinition of SLA, or they must engage directly with the educational and political systems that persist in devaluing the knowledge and work of teachers, while preventing them from engaging in the sort of reflective practice that would sustain the kind of relationship between research and pedagogy that is most desirable. That's what I wrote in '96. And you might see the words reflective practice there. Reflective practice has certainly been articulated already in this conference several times, in particular associated with the work of Tom Farrell here. I don't know if he's here. Tom, are you in the pub or are you here? Where are you? Anyway, I looked up, seeing that the words reflective practice were in there down in 1996, I looked up to see what Tom Farrell was up to in 1996, to see if he hadn't already captured the critical reflection line. Actually, I was quite pleased to see that in 1996 he was writing about soap operas as a sort of source for listening comprehension work, so that's good, that's good. I'm all right. But I also, at that time, was not just trying to slightly defend, but also aggressively attack, in some sense, the research first line, the theory first line. I had tried to raise the flag for a more interactive perspective in work, a little piece I did promoting the more extreme forms of action research. Here, of course, I doff my hat and I bend the knee very definitely and seriously to the classic work of Dick Allwright, from whom we heard yesterday, who was well engaged in this already at that time, although of course he has some reservations about action research as sort of being too much of an imposition on teachers, and he's moved on to exploratory practice. But in his plenary yesterday, he also eventually moved to to use the word participant. So participant, actually, yes, exploratory practice, perhaps extending from participatory action research, that would be then another way of looking at a very interactive relationship between research and practice, particularly with this orientation to what Dick called lived, I think, exploratory practice or lived critical research. So there are some ideas that have been around for a long time, and as I was trying to dig myself out from the theory to practice line, I eventually encountered a useful term that I'd like to spend a bit of time with you on here. The term is praxis, which I found I was drawing on in probably the first stuff I published on critical pedagogy, pulling the term from a title that Walsh had produced. So this is a word that I think is highly relevant to the theme of the conference, and it allows more than a unidirectional connection between practice and theory. Praxis is theory-based research, theory-based practice, sorry. Praxis is theory-based practice. It's the practice that arises from theory, but it's practice that leads to the recreation of theory. So it's a really important thing, and it's going to allow us, I think, to think even more deeply about the relationship between practice and theory. Like a lot of useful words, though, it's around in with a number of different senses, a number of different meanings, and this is also something that Tom was pointing out earlier with regard to reflection and reflective practice. So let me just take a moment to warn you a little bit about the many meanings of the term praxis. For those in the US, in fact, they may know the word more commonly because it's a term for a very widely used teacher certification exam, the Praxis. Did you pass the Praxis, people say. And when the first Praxis test in connection with ELL certification came out, it was a pretty questionable entity. No wonder people hate the Praxis, as that t-shirt says. The questions on it were multiple choice questions like, Steve Krashen is famous for A, being rich, B, liking Korean food, C, comprehensible input, D, all of the above, that sort of a thing. It wasn't very satisfactory. The word praxis is also more untheoretically used in Swedish and Dutch, apparently, so consequently, it's a major do-it-yourself enterprise in Holland, folks. That's what the picture is showing you there. Get out and dig the garden and do some praxis. It also was a Japanese rock band, I bet you didn't know that, and a Yugoslavian Marxist journal, getting closer to the real truth here. Finally, we're going to need some praxis after this presentation. I didn't know that. It's a Portuguese beer from Coimbra. Okay, so, take your choice. Which praxis would you prefer? For the time being, stay with me on the theoretical praxis, Aristotelian praxis, but you may need some drinkable praxis later. I squeezed the term in at the end of my most recent book, Critical ELT in Action, Foundations, Promises and Praxis. So obviously I think it's good. Well, actually that title was given to me by the wonderful Naomi Silverman, but I do adhere to the idea that praxis is important. So there it is again. Here's why it's important. It stops us having to use two words. Instead of saying theory and practice, or practice and theory, and then worrying about the relationship between them, oh yes, okay, we should worry, but by separating them, you actually make things worse. So in considering a supposed relationship between theory and practice as a movement, a unidirectional movement, it would be better to simply choose a point of entry within a circle or spiral or dialectical interaction of professional praxis. And there's a little diagram that illustrates this, which I'm grateful to Annie Downey for. And that diagram will probably look quite familiar to anyone with an action research perspective, except in this diagram it's a circle, not a spiral. But anyway, I think you'll see it quite simple here. So with this, one identifies a problem, researches it, investigates it, one could say, develops a plan of action to address it, and it says problem, but it could be concern, and implements that action. It would be nice if it were a collective plan, but there's some tension there. And here's the point, though. At 5, if one's moving from, presumably, practice to something like evaluating the action, assess its efficacy, re-examine the state of the problem, well, I don't think you can do those things unless you already have, or you have arrived at, a concise, if tentative, understanding of the matter, and that's a way of saying theory. Grounded, tentative, local theory that's relevant to your needs and arises out of the problem situation. At this point, then, in doing praxis, one's moving from practice to theory, and of course then potentially going back through. And if you're an action research person, you'd expect to spiral at this point because your first solution to the problem might not be adequate, and you would go on and develop that through praxis. Let's build this out a little bit. There's a long history to the term. One of my themes today, I think, would be rather a theme that's a little bit behind the presentation, is the importance of trying to locate oneself within traditions. As I'm coming up to 60, I can say that us human beings spend a relatively small period of time on the planet, and it's not easy to do all you want to do, and that could be kind of frustrating. But if we see ourselves, particularly as teachers, as part of a long tradition in which we are just picking up the baton and trying to do something with it and then passing it on, that could be comforting, perhaps. So to know that the term praxis is one that's been used and under development in Western philosophy since at least Aristotle might help some of us. The point here also is to build out that rather simple diagram and contextualize it a little bit, put it in more human terms. In this version, from Magnus Engdahl, we can't really move towards any relationship between research and practice until we know kind of what we're doing, where we're going, what is the good. People begin with a situation or question which they consider in relation to what they think makes for human flourishing. So we actually, as teachers, should be thinking, what are we trying to do here? And I hope we are trying to contribute to human flourishing, however you understand that. And then in addition, second point, or second item on the diagram list there, we absolutely have to think of teaching as engaging in a moral practice. We are humans working with other humans. We can hurt them, we can harm them, we can hinder them, or we can help them, but we have to take our relationship with them rather seriously. They are not pieces of metal. We cannot just bang them around and hope to get them into shape. We have to treat them, as Kant says, as ends in themselves, and that means we have to be guided by a moral disposition. In this case, to act truly and rightly. In Aristotelian terms, this is phronesis. And then and only then can we engage with the situation as committed thinkers and actors. And the outcome is not singular. The outcome is, once again, that interactive process that is praxis, that movement between research and theory, or theory and practice, and back again. So Aristotle may have started this, and people are continuing to work with the concept and develop it. And here's a recent book by Stephen Kemmis. Kemmis is long associated with, again, the more critical forms of action research, participatory action research, which he worked on famously with Robin McTaggart in Australia. And now in this recent book by Sense Publishers, a good publisher incidentally, worth noting, their definition of praxis is morally committed educational action, oriented and informed by educational theories and traditions. There's that word, tradition again. There's also morally committed, I think that's important, and it's action informed by theory and tradition. And they do some detailed analytic work first, and then they go and present some case studies. I'll come back to them in a little while. Just to suggest that there are other folks well in our area working in this domain, I'd just like to say thank you to Sue Garton, who's here and has been presenting for her book with Julian Edge, which at a much, more of a beginning level, nevertheless tries to take teachers into a more developed forms of ELT practice but starting with their experience and moving towards knowledge, as the title says. Good on you, Aston. Finally, in talking about the meanings and uses of this term, praxis, there's a word web that pulls together some of the things I've already mentioned, such as Aristotle and reflection and facets. No, I don't remember saying anything about that. I should note that the term is also quite strongly associated with more radical traditions. This is a quote from Bill Tierney, who is a fairly well-known curriculum and research specialist, and for him, praxis involves a commitment to challenging the status quo and helping people from marginalized communities understand their oppression. And in the very first sentence in that quote, he draws the term praxis close to the work of Paulo Freire and his followers, and that is a position I will end up at the end of this talk. So, praxis, perhaps in a way, slightly better term than practice or theory, and that's the term I would like to work with here further. So I move on now to say a little bit about how we could conceptualize philosophy of teaching in terms of a practice to theory initial move. I think a philosophy of teaching is a good thing to have, and I've been helping some of my teachers, the folks who go through the MA program in particular at the University of Hawaii, and the very large numbers of successive groups of Korean teachers that we get at UH to work on their philosophies of teaching. Even before the Korean government started putting a lot of money into 4 or 5 month training programs for state Korean teachers, we were getting quite regular contingents of Koreans coming through. And but in the last, 15 years, every 6 months we have quite a chunk of state high school and then elementary Korean teachers who have been coming through, and I have the pleasure of working with them. So even though I don't come to Korea very much, we are continually getting kind of a second-hand sense of what's going on in particularly the elementary and high school classrooms in Korea. So I think a philosophy of teaching understood as an organized and coherent set of principles which can guide one's practice is valuable, and it can aid the movement from practice to theory. How do you get a philosophy of teaching? What resources are needed for getting it? Well, perhaps most of those resources are practice in some sense. First of all, as has been mentioned before in this conference, we all are the inheritors of, 14, 15 more years, as Lorty says, of observation of classrooms. We have our own, of course, experience as a teacher, which we have reflected upon, thanks to Tom. And we have mentors and major role models that we can think about. And we have the literature of teaching, particularly longer teacher autobiographies and narratives. Lots and lots of practice to draw upon. I believe there is a role for philosophy of education in this area, though you might think of it as not practice but theory. But I'd like to suggest it's an interpretive lens which can be used to understand practice and help that practice move forward. It's particularly, I think, useful because it can help teachers historicize their practice as well as critique it. What do I mean by historicize? Well, what do I mean by historicize? We need to put our work in historical context. There's an ahistoricity in applied linguistics. People seem to think that it started with, I don't know, if it's SLA, people think it started with Steve Krashen. Dick Allwright mentioned the beginnings of the audiolingual method. But we can and should probably push things much further back, partly by integrating our practice with traditions in education as a whole. I think it helps us to understand these things. When I'm working with teachers, I try to encourage them to develop a philosophy of teaching statement, some kind of critical rationale that focuses on important components in this area. And I have been drawing on, the work of Schoenwetter et al., who are some Canadians, there we are, who have been doing some research in this area. Not to worry. What's in it? Components: aims, values, beliefs, and convictions. The values part is really important. Beliefs and convictions, yes. Of course, we have to have the factual professional knowledge that we base our professional teaching on. And that's in a way where the field has tended to be too much, in my opinion. Part of what I'm trying to do, and have been trying to do for a little while now, is to bring up the values components of the field. We need a philosophy of teaching statement. If you think we need one, I'll try and persuade you. One reason is that you just get asked about this increasingly at job interviews. What is your philosophy of teaching? I don't know. Not good, get the next one in, come on. Or contract renewals. That's if you actually have a job to be renewed. I was just hearing some folks talking about the cutbacks in the hiring of native speakers at Korean universities, so I'm sorry to hear about that. Actually, that means you might have a greater need of a philosophy of teaching statement because some of you are going straight off to a job interview in Canada or somewhere. But more seriously, I think we as teachers, if we are trying to make sense of our life through being a teacher, then we need to have a rationale for our meaningful life. We need a personal philosophy, and that's important. The development of a philosophy of teaching is, like the praxis idea, probably a cyclical process. Here's more from Schoenwetter et al., in which I think it's fairly obvious that they think of this as a cyclical process. Ideally, teachers get together in a context of collegiality and collaboration and try to pull together initial material, gather material for developing a philosophy of teaching. They probably should try to express it. At least I think they should try to express it. There's some value to trying to make the tacit temporarily explicit so you can think about it, reflect upon it, and so on. And the final box on that chart there, the idea is that it is, of course, used and applied, and then, again, cycling back, perhaps changing over time. My teachers, some of my younger teachers say to me, it's really hard to write a philosophy of teaching statement, Graham, because I don't feel like I've finished yet. And I say, no, it's not. We're just trying to get you started here. Don't worry, this is a tentative thing. And I hope if we have a chance to reflect, we'll revise it over time. There are some of the questions that people have used to get this sort of thing going. And how do I measure successful teaching? That's probably based on our knowledge base, our professional knowledge. But some of those questions there are clearly more in the values area. What values do I wish to impart to students? What code of ethics guides me? Asking questions like this may be a little difficult if you're in that part of TESOL which sees itself as fairly instrumentally oriented, the private language school sector. You know, they pays their money and they takes their choice. I'm just here to deliver the language and get my paycheck. But if you're trying to make sense of your life as a teacher, I don't think you would look at it that way. Philosophy of education, philosophy of teaching, it involves conceptual analysis. And here the key point, or the key concept I would want to see some examination of, is the term professional, or professionals. What's involved in being a professional? For me, again, a key point is that being a professional means you have values. Language teaching, teaching in general, it's not a neutral activity. You can't do this in a neutral way. As soon as you stand up in the classroom, the students, the kids, even the adults, will get a sense of who you are, why you're there, what you believe, just in terms, of course, in how you relate to them, in a personal manner, in a caring manner, in an authoritarian manner, who knows. It must, by definition, be guided by values. And again, if you can't manifest those values, unless you're trying to make sense of your life in some other way, then you yourself will be hindered and harmed. You will be trying to deal with an alienated life. So we should all be looking for ways to manifest our values in our teaching, and that might mean to start with to figure out what those values are. So the resources, I've mentioned some of the resources, and here's a shameless commercial break. my book, Values, Philosophies and Beliefs in TESOL, is intended to provide more of those resources, particularly from the philosophy of education. Okay, philosophy of education sounds like a bunch of white-bearded old guys like me putting their long-winded thoughts on paper. But a lot of them were teachers to start with. And I don't think this area should be ignored. I think it might be able to assist, as I say, in a movement from praxis to personal theory. But those long-winded guys tend to hit you with a lot of difficult questions, like what is truth? And said jesting Pilate and would not stay for an answer. He didn't have a plenary to do, and I see I have only X minutes left. But these are important questions. For example, what about knowledge of language? What do you think knowledge of language is? Goes directly to how you deliver your work in the classroom. If you think it's a set of structures, that's one thing. If you think it's a set of, if it's knowing, that takes you in an entirely different direction. So those are important questions, and certainly I think that the values questions remain important. But this is not a good way to get into things. And if you're in a bit of a hurry, or if you're running a short workshop for teachers, I would suggest getting into this area by way of the systematizations of philosophy of education that have been provided to us by scholars in this area. And I'll just focus on one of several sets of systems, the idea that there are philosophies of schooling, that there have been movements in the history of schooling that have philosophically distinct bases. The thing here is that these are packages of perhaps practices, of values, of concepts. And probably some teachers, some of us, have been working with these but unwittingly. And if you find out what they are, you might be able to say, oh, aha, I realize now that I have been basically operating out of a particular movement or philosophy of schooling. And that means I probably do already have some of the material I need for a philosophy of teaching statement, or I can explore what is in this and see whether I really do commit to certain of its parts. So let's take one of them, at least. Progressivism, associated with the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau originally. That was purely fictional, of course. His book, Émile, talking about the upbringing of a child, a boy child, incidentally. Rousseau was a bad man. He was terrible with women. He gave away his babies to orphanages and had horrible things to say about women, but he had some interesting things to say about the education of boys. Those ideas were successful in the sense that his work was a bestseller, Amazon, top of the Amazon list for 1794. And luckily for us, his ideas were taken up by real teachers like Pestalozzi, who ran an experimental school in Yverdon in Switzerland for a long time, and everybody went and visited and picked up ideas from Pestalozzi. And of course, by the time it gets to the 20th century, then we have John Dewey pitching in, and Dewey also turns out to be the sort of all-time great #1 philosopher of education. Probably because he lived to be about 97, so he just kept on publishing and publishing and publishing. Jack Richards, where are you? It doesn't take very long, looking at the key points of progressivism, well, I will say, to make some connections to second language teaching. Progressive ideas are child-centered, student-centered, activity-based, can I say task-based at this point, oriented to natural forms of growth, can I say natural approach at this point, experiential, developmental, putting people in small groups. Bill Littlewood, where are you? So actually it's not just there in the key points. If you want to trace the interesting history of the origins of CLT, read what A.P.R. Howitt said in the detailed account he provided in his History of English Language Teaching. Just kind of, don't think we have enough time. I think I'll just tell you to go and read it. But there's a strange trace movement of these ideas from the US to British elementary schools after World War II, and they're sucking into the early ESL materials in the UK, from which they were then taken up by early CLT folks like John Sinclair. So what it really comes down to is, if you're doing CLT, actually you're doing progressive education with all of the values that are associated with it possibly. There's John Dewey, incidentally, Tom Farrell had a picture of him last night in which he said that he looked about like Hitler because of his moustache. Well, I've got a better moustache picture there. And there's at least two or three others, or three or four others, other key movements that one can consider. For example, Reconstructionism. This was another movement in education which pushed Dewey's ideas further in the direction of social change. And these ideas continue and manifest themselves in critical language pedagogy. Or one can say, what about Essentialism? These were Dewey's opponents. Back in 1935, Demjaskovich coined the term Essentialism and said, basically, we just need to teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. Curricula should be founded on the needs of commerce and industry. If you are teaching a curriculum, or if you are engaging in teaching practices that are entirely driven by the needs of business and industry and the things that will help people get a job, well, you may be an essentialist. You may be operating out of the essentialist position. And, well, if so, maybe you should think seriously about it. Is that actually what you really want to be doing as a teacher? Or maybe, if you're lucky to be in one of the more like world languages programs that still use literature a great deal, you may be in the perennialist tradition, trying to transmit values and cultures for all time. And there's a lot more in the philosophy of education, in particular its analyses of aims of educational practice. Most teachers are never asked really what their aims are, or if you ask them what their aims are, they tend to relate to just helping individuals, helping the kids, helping the students learn English properly. They don't think of themselves as having possibly an aim at a societal level. Yet teachers are one of the major entities, major groups. School is one of the major institutions that reconstructs or constructs or transmits societal values. So when you are a teacher, you are actually playing a role in society whether you like it or not, willy-nilly. So you might think about whether you have societal aims and so on. However, shifting a little bit here, I'm sorry to say that language teachers' working conditions are not generally those which allow for the kind of reflection or even the kind of praxis that I've been talking about so far. A very valuable presentation yesterday at this conference was by Jason Di Gennaro. I would love to think that he's here. I want to say thank you very much to him for his very valuable work. His paper yesterday on the changing face of professionalism in Korean public schools, he interviewed or did an extended interview-based study of 8 public school teachers. He says that they have a strong identity as being professionals tied to their graduate degrees, but it seems like they didn't have a very sophisticated, perhaps, understanding of professionalism. At the same time, he was able to say that under the developments in Korean public schools, they were clearly being deprofessionalized. He said this was due to the marketization and commercialization of education. Standardized test scores are the only outcomes that the teachers are being asked to consider now. He cited an OECD study which says that esteem for being a teacher in Korea is at an all-time low. And I asked him how these teachers' values have changed since these were veterans or mid-career people, and he said they've become very bitter, very demotivated. I'm not surprised, but this is why, on the one hand, one can think about trying to make sense of a life through praxis, through professional practice, but on the other hand, one might find difficulty knowing where to go if one can't deliver on those sort of professional ideals. I think bitterness is what happens when there's absolutely no clarity as to what kind of a stance to take. And I've been worrying about this for some time, not just Di Gennaro's work, but my own work back in the 90s, interviewing teachers, ESL programs in the US about their working conditions. It's the same thing. They don't have time to read the research. They're trying to stitch together a life out of 3 jobs, running up and down the freeway flyers, they're called. They don't read the research. They hardly have time to talk to each other. But they know that things are not right. If you have a sense that things are not right, if you have a sense of recognition concerning the lack of professional working conditions, then where might you go in terms of a philosophy of teaching or some kind of theory, perhaps, to be arrived at through reflection on the oppressive conditions of practice. Chemist and Smith have thought about this a bit too. Going back to the term praxis, they say it's endangered today. It's something valuable, but something that is being edged aside in late modern times or in post-modern times. It's being edged aside by that form of practice that amounts simply to following rules. And they say, right at the bottom, highlighted at the bottom there, at some point, hemmed in by rules, the educator may become no more than the operative of some system, an operative of an organization. If that's what's happening to you, then, well, then we need some of that praxis that we looked at earlier, the liquid form, perhaps. But it leads me to be much more skeptical and questioning about the role of education in society. A lot of the time, education is not being delivered by professionals who have practice theorized, that is to say, professionals who have extensive expertise. They are not being allowed to capitalize on their substantial professional knowledge, even derived from research, which is to say, theory practiced. So if you have this kind of skeptical view of education, what philosophy of language education is appropriate to it? If you go back historically, I'd say, there it is, it was there in the past, Reconstructionism. During the 30s, during the Great Depression, educators in America in particular said, we have to do something about this. Even whatever little we can do, whatever stance we can take, we've got to point in the right direction, even if we can't really make a great deal of movement. And they said they would provide curricula that would aid in the reconstruction of society. In terms of practice, the term that should be used for this these days is critical language pedagogy, if it's in our field. And yes, okay, yeah, well, I have to say I've got something to say on the topic, but when I say something on this topic, and I'm only going to say a little bit now, and I'm going to say some more this afternoon, I want to emphasize that I am simply picking up and reflecting the work of many people who have gone before me. I am just a beginner in this area. So let me draw to your attention this domain of practice, which is a response to a critical or skeptical position, and only, as I say, hint at a few aspects of it. There's a definition from Alistair Pennycook. Critical pedagogy views schools as cultural areas where diverse ideological and social forms are in constant struggle. This is important. It means we stop talking about society. We stop talking about what society wants, and we start recognizing that society is a bunch of elements which are in constant struggle, and that means probably the top is telling the bottom what to do and the bottom is resisting it. It seeks to understand and critique the historical and socio-political context of schooling, and to develop pedagogical practices that aim not only to change the nature of schooling, but also the wider society. So there are practices involved. Pennycook puts them a bit optimistically, but there are slightly different ways of doing school that one could try to strive towards if one had this kind of perspective. And it's still the practice to theory theme. It seems like one could turn to theory from practice when the practice is bad or unsatisfactory. And that's what some people have done in critical pedagogy. They've recognized the contradictions in the practice context. Before I give you a few examples, or just a couple of examples, let me say that there is no one practice of critical pedagogy. It's continually reconstructed, and I think most of the time anyone who's trying to do it can only do a little bit of it. But it probably involves any kind of elements that come from the logic here, and the aim is active citizenship for social change. That means that the student has to have a very active role, that things like critical dialogue, student-created materials, negotiated syllabuses are used, and theories of language, not to mention education and society, are used, which are social in nature and reflect an understanding of power. Very different and quite challenging and not easy. And all the way along, in any kind of initial attempt to introduce this perspective, there's an action orientation. So here's a quote from Henry Giroux, one of the big names of critical pedagogy. Here, this is from an interview he was doing. It's a little simplistic, a little off the cuff, but it explains, or it certainly conforms to the practice to theory theme. He says, "I came to critical pedagogy because I didn't have the means to back up what I wanted to do. I wanted the chairs in the circle. The principal said I couldn't. I didn't have an argument to give him. But just a few days earlier, someone had given me a copy of Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I went home, I stayed up the whole night, and I was hooked." It's nice. It's arriving at theory by happenstance, perhaps, through some troubles with practice and the backing up of practice. Here's a two-part quote from Paulo Freire in dialogue with Ira Shaw. It's a much heavier duty quote, and it is really here just to illustrate that Freire is someone himself who recognizes the problems when practice and theory are separated, and yet is looking or examining cases where they kind of interact. What happens then when a young teacher meets for the first time the hypothesis of changing his or her behavior in the classroom? What happens when the young teacher meets the possibility of changing her or his teaching practice? Maybe she or he read some text and thinks for the first time to become a critical educator. What happens? Well, Freire says he comes to the classroom with a new conviction, but this new teacher was already shaped into the dichotomy between text and context. This is the dichotomy between theory and practice. It's hard to overcome this. The teacher has a hard time giving witness in overcoming the rupture of intellectual study from the experience of the world. Dialectically connecting the two, which have been separated so far and for so long, is opposite to the teacher's official training. And I think, although that's rather high-flown, it's the same point that Tom Farrell was making earlier, that our professional training, our teacher education programs don't make enough effort to help teachers connect the two, to move between them. Freire would say dialectically. So, finally, here's one from Mary Cowhees, who writes inspirationally about elementary classroom practice that is guided by critical pedagogy. She's not really a language person, although language comes in there some of the time. And here I think she is close to Dick Allwright also, seeing the students as, not just the teachers as moving from practice to theory, but the students also moving from practice to theory or from exploration to knowledge. Because she says she wants the students to be able to struggle for truth and reason. And in particular, along with those conventional critical pedagogy points, the purpose of education in an unjust society is to bring about equality and justice, and students must play an active part in the learning process. Most importantly in this case, teachers and students are both simultaneously learners and producers of knowledge. If we could structure our classrooms so that we were learning along with students, and students were learning along with us, and students had a role in the production of knowledge, as the Brazilian kids in the program that Dick Allwright presented to us were, then we would be on a path that would be, frankly, a lot more professional in some sense of the word, a lot more morally desirable in my opinion, and in the long run moving towards a society in which teachers were given professional working conditions and were trusted to operate out of a moral understanding, instead of being given through No Child Left Behind entirely scripted lessons. That's what's happening at the moment. Teachers are not only being given curricula concerning which they have no input, they're not only being given and told which books to use, they're being given materials which say what they are to say, scripted lessons. That is where things are going in many parts of the world. Teachers are being deprofessionalized, and if we are facing up to that point, not just the working conditions that are poor, not just the fact that you don't have proper teacher development sessions, that you don't have pensions and healthcare, and you don't have tenure, but in particular in some parts of the world, teachers just have no choice, no ability to exercise the professional knowledge that we, some of us at least, are trying to generate through teacher education and through research. Those are the conditions that a lot of teachers are facing, and then for people like me, the question is, where do we go? How do I stand? What kind of objectives do I do I try to achieve? And so if you, like me, recognize the contradictions that we face, then you, like me, would be developing a critical theory of society, in which case it would be natural to draw on a critical theory of education for our developing praxis. And in language terms, as I said before, that's critical language pedagogy. And you may arrive at the theory of critical pedagogy through these challenges that I've mentioned. If you're trying to implement morally committed professional practice, and if you're trying to make sense of your life as a teacher working in an inequitable society, if that's what you're interested in, then I invite you to do critical language pedagogy, and I invite you to my second talk this afternoon. Thank you very much.